Good evening. The time is now 7 p.m. I'd like to call this minute Board of Selectmen Affordable Housing Plan Public Informational Meeting to order at 7 p.m. I ask you to please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. For those who came in, there were some documentation in the back of the room to help us out with the reporting. So what we'd like to do is have just a review of the proposed affordable housing plan. And with that, I would turn you to read the microphone at all time. It might help. Just can't go too far.
Thank you, Mr. First Selectman. And thank you, members of the audience, for attending. My name is Guszkowski. I am a principal and planner with the TYCHE Planning and Policy Group based in Vernon, Connecticut. And we've been hired to work with the town to help prepare the town's affordable housing plan, the first affordable housing plan under the new state law. My partner Mike and I both worked on this project, and I'm going to sort of buzz through the PowerPoint presentation relatively quickly, but if anyone has questions, the selectmen or the audience, please feel free to interrupt. The TYCHE Planning and Policy Group does basically municipal planning, working with towns, for towns, across basically the easterly two-thirds of the state, and work actively, particularly in Northeast Connecticut, where I've served as a town planner in Woodstock and Thompson and in Hampton, and have worked with their town planner, Mary Ann, for quite some time. We have worked on a number of affordable housing plans with municipalities across Connecticut in the past. We wrote one of the first municipal affordable housing plans in Essex, which was a very involved public process that wrapped up about 2 years ago. And are in process of working on several others, including the towns of Middlefield and Durham, Woodbury, Old Saybrook, and the town of Avon. Actually, the town of Old Saybrook just adopted their affordable housing plan just a couple of weeks ago. A little bit of background of what affordable housing is and why affordable housing plans have been mandated. Back in 2017, the state passed Public Act 17-170, which required every municipality in the state of Connecticut to prepare every 5 years a plan to increase the number of affordable housing developments in town. I've highlighted this what I've shown on the screen is the entirety of that state statute. It's quite short. And the level of detail provided in the requirement for every municipality is extraordinarily limited. In fact, I've highlighted really the only relevant section of this entire statute, which is what I just said, that every 5 years, every municipality shall write a plan to specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in that municipality. And that's it. It doesn't say who in the town adopts it. It doesn't say what that number ought to be. It doesn't make distinction between big towns and little towns. It doesn't set a numerical target. It just says the town needs to come up with a plan. If they choose to have a public hearing, there's a little bit in the statute about the method in which they go about having a public hearing, but the statute doesn't even require that. It's fairly open-ended and fairly wide open, and so it's open to a bunch of different municipal approaches to writing it. And so it really is up to each town to determine how they will do this. And in the case of Plainfield, I worked very closely with your planning director, with Mary Ann, the Board of Selectmen, and some public outreach to try to get a sense of what would be appropriate for the town of Plainfield. When we talk about affordable housing, and again, the statute itself does not define what affordable housing is. And so we've taken sort of a dual approach to how we understand affordable housing. Affordable housing can be thought of as capital A affordable, which is the state statutory definition of affordable. Not in the statute that we just saw, but in a different section of Section 8-30 of the statutes, the Affordable Housing Appeals Act does define affordable as those properties that are income limited or deed restricted in some way. Whether it's properties that are purchased with the help of CHFA or USDA mortgages, whether it's properties for rent that are income restricted for a period of 40 years, whether it's properties that are subject to Basically, Section 8, vouchers, income or rental assistance programs, or some other incentive housing programs. And the state keeps track of those capital A affordable units over the course of a year by year by year. And for every community that does not hit a 10% threshold of its community with those capital A restricted affordable units, then the terms of the Section 830G Affordable Housing Appeal Statute apply to that community. In the case of Plainfield, Plainfield is over 12% of its housing stock as capital A affordable. So that the terms of that statute do not apply to Plainfield. However, that is not the only, and so in some cases, a lot of towns, actually most towns in Connecticut, do not have the threshold that Plainfield and a few other communities have. They are not at that 10%, let alone 12% like Plainfield. So many communities looking at a Plainfield type situation would say, that's our target. Once we hit that 10%, we're done. But that's not the only affordability issue. We also refer to as small A affordable, or naturally occurring affordable housing, or the acronym for that is NOAA. And these are basically properties that are just less expensive. These are properties that are just slightly more attainable for people at slightly lower portions of the income spectrum. So, an accessory apartment, a unit above somebody's garage, maybe an older garden apartment, it's just not that expensive because of the way that the market goes. Those are naturally occurring, and encouraging those types of apartments, those types of housing opportunities is also important. And so, in this plan, we tried to look at encouraging both types. And in either case, we are trying to encourage the increased number of properties that people can afford, spending no more than 30% of their income on that housing unit. And if you think about that, if someone makes, let's say, $66,000 a year, 30% of that, it should go a little bit easier than that. Someone makes $50,000 a year, 30% of that is $15,000 a year. And then if you divide that by 12, that's about $1,200 a month or so, give or take. That would be dedicated to housing costs. So that if you go above that 30% threshold, then you're cutting into a person's ability to afford things like food and health insurance and transportation and entertainment and educational expenses and things like that. And so affordability, generally speaking, whether it's capital A or small a, should be targeted at that 30% income threshold or lower. A couple of examples, because there are a lot of misperceptions out there. When you think of affordable housing, the tendency is to think of some large, 1960s, 1970s style housing project, high-rises in New York, Cabrini in Chicago, very run down, very dangerous, very scary. But affordable housing is not that. There are tons of examples, particularly in suburban Connecticut, that are extraordinarily pleasant and fit in very, very well to their communities. This is an example called Ferry Crossing in Old Saybrook. This is 16 units. They're all affordable, and they're designed not only to be available to the folks from lower portions of the income spectrum, but also to fit in terms of their character and their design with the community. A lot of retrofitting. This is out in Litchfield, where there was an old fire station building that was underutilized. It wasn't being employed anymore. The town had built a new fire station. And so they retrofitted this with a couple of units. And these are not only affordable, but one is universally accessible. The town of Essex, where I also do a lot of work, recently built a 52-unit apartment building under the 830G Affordable Housing Appeals Statute. These are 52 units, 16 of which are income restricted as affordable. Some had a 60% area median income, some had an 80% area median income. They were immediately occupied. There was no vacancy there. And they generated only one kid to the schools, which is another concern frequently of affordable housing, that, oh my goodness, they're going to overrun our schools with kids and blow out our school budgets and things like that. It just doesn't happen. And these are 1- and 2-bedroom units. As they said, they generated one kid. That kid actually already lived in town and moved into this unit. So the 52 units in Essex did not increase the school population at all. Debunking a couple of myths about affordable housing. We talked a little bit about, appearance and community character and things like that. Hopefully you saw that they can be done extremely well. This chart shows what happens to property values both in the area of a new affordable housing complex and in areas away from the affordable housing complex. This was taken from Fairfield County. The line in the middle shows you property values before the construction of the affordable housing development. And to the right of the line is property values after. And you really can't tell much difference. One of those lines is properties in the immediate vicinity of the affordable housing development, and one of those lines is in areas away from it, so that would not be affected by sort of the quote-unquote character of that affordable housing complex. You really can't tell the difference. There is no fundamental statistical difference between property values before and after, or I should say, close to or away from an affordable housing development. It is an important and integral part of a community, and it is part of the overall success of the community. We talked a little bit about the school kids in the Essex development. This is borne out statistically, where you basically have, and this was again another Fairfield County study, where you basically do not generate any significant levels of school kids, which is not always a good thing because communities also have to grow and communities need vibrancy. But if you're talking about building 1- and 2-bedroom rental units, they just do not generate the levels of school kids that your traditional, that smaller scale affordable housing 1- and 2-bedroom units generate school kids. It's simply not true. So that's a little bit of background about affordable housing generally. In the plan itself, we looked through what Plainfield's current situation is. As I mentioned, Plainfield is, and there's a laser portion of this too, right? Okay, yeah. Plainfield is at, and this is a little bit dark, of its a little over 6,000 housing units, a little over 775 are deemed affordable. That's 12%, so that, as we said, the town is not subject to the 830G Affordable Housing Appeals Act. It still is majority single-family detached. It's very much a suburban, rural Connecticut community where basically 2/3 of its housing stock is single-family detached. But there is a pretty good mix of smaller scale multifamily, so we have almost 10% are basically duplex or 2-family units. A good percentage, almost 9%, are 3- or 4-bedroom, 3- or 4-unit apartments. And then you have a couple of larger complexes that are 5 to 9 to 10, 19, or 20 or more. There's another 6 or 7% of that larger housing development. So there's a pretty decent mix in Plainfield. But again, much like most of Connecticut, particularly eastern Connecticut, this is the housing starts over the last several years, back from 1990. We see, the uptick in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then obviously the crash in 2007, 2008. Which is right over here, and it's been relatively quiet since that point. And this is, seen in, this is Plainfield up here, this is Windham County, and this is the state. It's been a relatively slow growth time throughout the state, and Plainfield is no exception to that. We talked a little bit about the diversity of the housing stock. Plainfield is actually very similar to Windham County and Connecticut in general, where about 60%, just over 60% of its units are owner-occupied. The rest are either vacant or renter-occupied, and it's fairly consistent, high 20s, low 30s, across Plainfield, Windham County, and Connecticut. That's sort of the blend. There are portions certainly in other parts of Windham County and certainly in other parts of the state where it's much more heavily owner-occupied, but Windham has sort of that balance that's reflective of the state. We talked a little bit about that magic number of 30% or less of spending income on housing. That 30% threshold is considered the cost burden line. So if you're spending more than 30% of your income on your housing situation, you're considered cost burden. If you're spending more than 50%, you're considered severely cost burden. And so this chart on the right shows where Plainfield stacks up, not only relative to Windham County, but to Connecticut. And so these two, the two shades of blue, to the left of those show that 20% of the town in Plainfield is considered cost burden, which is to say they spend more than 30% of their income on their housing. And the severely cost burden is another 24%. So you have just a little under half of Plainfield does spend more than they ought to, more than they can truly afford on their housing situation. And it's not just those folks in lower income apartments. Very frequently, it is owner occupancy situation. People who have retired or on fixed incomes are in houses that are more than they can afford. And they don't have necessarily any great options to sell or to move on or to get out of that situation. So they're stuck to a certain extent. The slightly good news is that Plainfield is doing a little bit better than Windham County generally or the state of Connecticut, where both of those entities are 5 to 10% higher in terms of cost burden percentage than the town of Plainfield. In terms of its demographics, Plainfield is at its basic population peak for the projectable future. So this chart on the left shows you the Connecticut State Data Center's population projections. So Plainfield has had sort of slow, steady growth for the last 40 years or so. This line is 2020. And you can see that the projected population in Plainfield is basically expected to level out and maybe decrease over the next 15 or 20 years. However, even though Plainfield's population isn't going to grow dramatically, that doesn't mean that we don't need more affordable housing units, particularly for those who are going to be downsizing, seniors, empty nesters, folks like that. And what we are also seeing is a trend of shrinking household size. So back in 2000, the household size in Plainfield was about 2.65. As of 2018, it had shrunk down to 2.62. And that's not an enormous difference, but over thousands and thousands of households, that makes a difference. And you actually could see a situation where your population doesn't grow, but your number of households do grow, and that feeds your demand for all variety of housing opportunities, and particularly for smaller houses. As I said at the beginning, we did a number of elements to this plan, and we did some community surveying. We put out a survey on SurveyMonkey, which is an online polling platform, asking people if a number of questions about their own housing situation and their feelings about affordable housing now and into the future in Plainfield, and how important it is to Plainfield's future. And generally speaking, people were very strongly in agreement that affordable or attainable housing is an important component to Plainfield's longevity and Plainfield's vitality. A significant majority of folks said yes. And people were mixed when we asked the question, do you think that Plainfield's existing housing stock is sufficient? And I think that we have a little less than half saying it's not sufficient. A little slightly more than well, it's actually thirds. Slightly more people said, no, the housing stock is not adequate to satisfy future needs. And I think we can see that in some of the demographics that we looked at earlier, where we're looking at roughly half of the population, maybe a little bit less, 40%, 45%, is cost burden. And as we look to the future, people don't necessarily see their incomes rising at a sufficient level that they would be looking to make significant housing upgrades. And so it leads to some uncertainty about housing situations in the future. We asked people who new housing or who housing planning should occur for, what types of groups, and the most popular options were seniors, young professionals, and young families. And so those folks are, again, seniors who are probably downsizing, young families who are just sort of getting started, and young professionals who are looking for your 1 or 2 bedroom units, sort of starter situations. Those are the things that people feel should be priorities in town. We also asked if we're going to be planning for future housing opportunities, is there anywhere geographically that made more sense than others in town? And people were mixed on this. We asked about Plainfield Village, Central Village, Moosup, or Regan, or sort of a scatter. And it was fairly scattered. I would say Plainfield Village and Central Village. If you look at these elements on on the right side of each bar cluster, those were the higher priorities. So generally speaking, Plainfield Village and Central Village were the most popular targets for additional housing opportunities. So after looking at some of the statistics on the ground, the situations, and where Plainfield might be headed demographically, we have to ask the question, okay, there's a wide open process here. The town has to look at increasing the number of affordable housing developments in town. Should that increase be 1? Should that increase be 1,000? What should be the number? Should we work very hard on it or should we not? And I think the answer is we should do something. And because of the market, because of Plainfield's mix of rural and sort of urban village situations, the answer is not one single thing. It's not a single development that's going to be built right next to the new distribution center and will solve our affordable housing problems. It's going to be a distributed approach. There's a number of small steps that can be taken to move us further on down the line. And again, Plainfield is in a better situation than most communities. It has more than 12% of its housing is already deemed, formally capital A affordable, but more can be done. So we established some draft goals that were presented in the plan, and I'm just going to read these with apologies for reading directly from a PowerPoint. But the goals were to increase the number of USDA and CHFA loans through public information about these resources. And the reason that this one is important is because that doesn't cost the community anything. A CHFA and a USDA loan is provided by state government, federal government, and it doesn't require the town to expend any of its funds or to accept less taxes or anything like that. It just allows people to get into an ownership situation who wouldn't necessarily ordinarily be able to under traditional lending or traditional mortgages. So it just expands the potential pool of buyers and really helps the town's opportunities. Other goals, we want to increase the total number of accessory dwelling units by reducing regulatory burdens. And in the course of writing this plan, the state actually changed its laws relative to local zoning for allowing accessory dwelling units. Should communities wish to comply with those, they do have the option of opting out.
Which we did.
Which you did? Okay. So, this recommendation still stands. To increase the number, now, an accessory dwelling unit, again, is sort of your in-law suite, your granny flat, the apartment above the garage, which generally speaking wouldn't count towards the town's capital A affordable because there's not necessarily any deed restriction or income limit on those units. However, if those property owners chose to place income limits on them, then those would count towards the town's affordable housing goals. One of the goals is to encourage that type of income limitation, even on those 1 and 2 unit accessory dwelling units. Certainly, the town has been doing a number of things through housing authorities, through promotion of different opportunities. We want to make sure that more of the public understands what resources are available through Plainfield and other entities. Make sure that people are aware of that. And then Plainfield does have a lot of history. We have a lot of historical houses, particularly in our villages, a lot of old mills, a lot of former schools and things like that, that some have already been redeveloped as housing. A lot more have the potential of that. And so we want to make it a little bit easier to retrofit and reuse. So those are the broad goals, and then we have a couple of areas of action items that we recommended. And again, these are all in the draft plan. Number 1 is just to make it somebody's job. Establish a housing committee. And the town can do this however it makes sense for the town's organizational structure. It doesn't need to be formally by ordinance that, a certain X number of voting members and they shall meet on this day of the month. It could be a relatively informal thing set up through the selectman's office, set up through planning and zoning. But it's important that someone is keeping an eye on how the town is doing outreach, how the town is providing for housing opportunities. So it's important to have someone tracking this. We want to ease the permitting requirements, as we discussed. Accessory apartments can frequently be kind of an onerous process and complicated, particularly for a housing owner that is not a sophisticated developer, doesn't do applications to planning and zoning every day of the week. So we want to make sure that this process is simpler and people can understand how to make better use of their properties, how to increase the types of housing opportunities through accessory dwelling units. And if the town is going to actively encourage these, then we should look at going the next step further and saying, how do we encourage people that have accessory apartments or are interested in setting aside space in their house, space above their garage, doing an addition for an accessory apartment, to make those available to folks at the lower end of the income spectrum. And perhaps there are tax incentives or other development inducements that the town could provide to make those a little bit more attractive to people. When we talk about retrofitting, we also want to recognize that there's a lot of development in certain areas, and I should say a lot of development potential in certain areas of town. In the historic village areas, you have a number of old mill structures, old commercial structures, large houses that aren't fully occupied, aren't fully utilized. And so we want to take a look at the zoning regulations and other municipal policies to make it a little bit easier for people to be encouraged and for people to understand that they can develop, they can add units to their large historic home in a way that doesn't sort of take away from the character of that historic area. And then also to take a look at allowing for higher density for some of these historic mill structures and old commercial structures and old school facilities in a way that would make multifamily development possible. We certainly want to promote loan and financing programs. We talked about CHFA and USDA. There are other loan programs and financing assistance programs out there. So we want the town to make sure people know about this. And it's not just your miscellaneous homeowners, but program information should be shared out through banks, through realtors, through brokers, through developers, so that they understand that these programs are there. And what that does is it widens the net of possible buyers, because these USDA, CHFA, and other financing programs really make it possible for people at a much wider spectrum of income to afford ownership opportunities. As the town had done previously, redeveloping old municipal properties, maybe they're school buildings, maybe they're municipally owned properties that have been acquired through foreclosure or through tax auction, that the town should take a look at reusing some of those municipal properties for housing opportunities. And then to consider partnerships. Partnerships with nonprofits, partnerships with developers, or property owners who want to do something good with their land, but don't have the sophistication or aren't really developers per se. The town could look at partnering and assisting the development of more housing opportunities. And so with all of those goals and these implementation suggestions, what we've done in the plan, and this is towards the back of the plan, we broke it down into an implementation table that not only breaks down each action item into specific steps, but provides a priority, a time frame, and a responsible party to make sure that this plan is trackable. And we can make sure we understand whose job is doing each item. So that is the overview of the plan. The town has basically between now and next year to adopt this to be formally in compliance with Section 830J of the Connecticut General Statutes, and then the town will have satisfied its requirement for the next 5 years, and at that point, the next affordable housing plan will be due. Mr. Selectman, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to accept any questions that the Selectmen or the audience may have.
One quick one for you. If we are to discuss and act on the proposal that you have in front of us, I know that there's still more work to be done, as you noted in the other actual adoption of the plan.
Right.
That last page is a lot of work. We're talking about anywhere from 1 to 5 years worth of continuous work, which I think is needed. It's something that you're looking for other people and other boards to buy into, understand, and to help with the development. So it's fine for us to adopt it. It's just a matter of us making sure we're working with the other boards and commissions and other parties to work for the conclusion of this. Would that be why we're talking about those as basically a 5-year plan?
Right. So it's Right, it's a 5-year plan. Not everything has to be done, before October, and so we've spaced this out. Certain things are important to sort of get started in the first year. Certain things may take 3-4 years. And the other thing we've done, we've tried to, as you say, involve other boards and commissions, kind of take the many hands make light work approach. There are a lot of steps here, but not any single entity, no board, no staff member is responsible for the whole thing. So across all these boards and commissions, across 5 years, I think this is doable. With the note, again, that this is a plan we're required to submit. As of right now, there's nothing in the statute that requires the town to prove completion. At the end of 5 years, there's no indication that the state is going to look at you and say, "Are you done? Have you finished your plan?" There's nothing like that. It is aspirational, but we've tried to break it down to make it doable also.
Thank you. Any other questions or public comments?
You said that Plainfield's at 12%, and most of the towns are below that, or the state minimum is 10%. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right, so Plainfield is at a little over 12% of what we call the capital A affordable. The number of, and the threshold for applicability of the state law or not is 10%. And so very briefly, if a town is under 10%, it's subject to that law, which means that a developer could basically force a development through planning and zoning. And planning and zoning, generally speaking, as long as you have sufficient wastewater and traffic and things like that, a local planning and zoning commission for a town under 10% really can't stop it. And so that example that I showed you in Essex, that was done, the town of Essex has only about 2% affordable. And so the town was basically powerless to stop that. It's good that it turned out well, but if the town was over 10%, that never would have happened in Essex. Of the 169 towns in Connecticut, I would say roughly 130 of them are below 10%. Most towns are well below. In fact, the average of the towns, I'm working with about 7 or 8 towns right now. The average threshold for those 7 or 8 towns is about 3%. There's not that many towns in a Plainfield situation.
So if the Board of Selectmen decides this evening to adopt this plan, are we necessarily committing what percentage we're going to grow over that 5 years, or just that we're adopting the plan?
Correct. It's actually, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, it's very confusing, even if I was clear about it. That 10% threshold is an entirely different section of the statutes than the requirement to write an affordable housing plan.
Okay, so they're not one and the same?
They're not one and the same. And some towns might use this affordable housing plan as an opportunity to target a number towards 10%. So maybe Essex is going to try to get to 4% in the next 5 years, right? They're never going to get to 10%, and then certainly in the next 5 years. Some towns are using that for a target, but this statute that requires this plan does not require any numerical target other than to increase. So it needs to be 1.
Okay.
And so really towns can set their own goals.
Okay, thank you.
My only question is probably for Kevin, but I don't know, if we adopt this, if we were to adopt this tonight, does that start this process, this 5-year process?
The date for tonight, yes.
Right. And the only requirement once it's adopted, I mean, again, there's nobody at the state sort of looking down on Plainfield and saying, all right, it's now the 3rd quarter of your first year, have you gotten these objectives done? Nobody's doing that. Literally the only requirement is that you file a copy of this with the Secretary of the Office of Planning and Policy Management. That's it, and then you're on your own. You police yourselves in terms of how rapidly or how completely you satisfy the plan.
Have the other land use boards, planning, zoning board of appeals, read through this?
They have not. They've been made aware of it, but
They have not read
the
through it,
plan.
and no input from them yet?
No.
Okay.
Probably note on that page 35 of that booklet that there are 4 major groups that are working cooperation. That is Board of Selectmen, Planning and Zoning, town planner, and if you notice, there's also a housing officer. So what we would probably be looking to do is, appoint a town housing officer to start the ball rolling and understand what the whole intent is, and just keep in mind that when they come in front of planning and zoning, what they're looking to do is, if it's a, I'll do a different number because I don't want to point to somebody, but if it's a 30-unit item coming forward, and we could see if we can encourage them to put some of the affordable housing within it, that helps us out, and it also helps out the residents. Right now, one of the things that's most lacking in this town, with all the development coming in, is housing. And we're looking at 2 different big projects that could be coming into our town, and we'd like to be able to encourage that, to be able to work with us. And that's what a housing officer can work with, is trying to get more of that data to help them out. So if we do adopt something, and then a housing unit comes in, we might be able to blend some of that in together.
That's precisely right.
So, I mean, it's a lot of work. I think once each of the boards reads through it, I think most of them will understand what we're trying to do and accomplish for housing for the future. The biggest piece to me is basically housing officer, because we need to incorporate that person with a title and have some functionality and some direction. So I like the whole plan. It gives more detail for making sure it's not so much you're not married to one to the other, but we're also looking to do that. We're trying to be proactive about what we're going to be doing for the future. So, other questions?
No, no.
Any other public comment?
Well, I had a concern, community survey results. You only have 61 people answer. That doesn't give a real good result of the town. Obviously, it wasn't advertised, it wasn't put out in front of people enough, and just to take a survey based on 61 people seems kind of short.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
We did not get the sort of results that we had hoped for. And I think recognizing that we don't have a strong sample size, we wanted to do 2 things, which is, number one, certainly reflect the input of those that did participate, because democracy is about showing up, and you can't force somebody to answer questions. So I think we wanted to respect the input that we received, but not weight it overly and assume that this was a 100% referendum on where the town ought to go. Recognizing it was a small sample size, I think we tended to lean heavier on sort of our wisdom about market dynamics, about demographics, about housing statistics, and about municipal policies as they affect housing or not.
And my other question is, why is the state getting involved so much with housing? This is 2017, and now they're trying to get involved with planning and zoning here in these towns. My question is why?
You could actually, if you're looking to point fingers,
No, I just want to know what they're up to.
I would actually start with the federal government.
Okay.
Because we passed, the federal government passed the Fair Housing Act a little over 50 years ago, I think 51 or 52 years ago now. And that Fair Housing Act requires states and municipalities to affirmatively further fair housing. And I think the state has been pretty lax, and municipalities have been fairly lax in satisfying what's actually a federal requirement. So I would note that in the last 5 years or so, the state has gotten more active, but it's really a matter of getting more active in holding both the states, because the state has put a lot of money in over the last 5-10 years, the state holding their own and municipalities' feet to the fire about what's federal law, basically. And zoning is one tool. And I know that there's a lot of sentiment about zoning being a local authority. And this is our town, this is our zoning, which has historically been how things function. But all authority, it is important to note that all authority for municipalities to control their own zoning is because the state has granted them that authority in Section 8-2 of the statutes. It is delegated to the town. It is not the town's birthright outside of the state constitution to control land use. It's an authority delegated by the state.
I thought that the federal government putting something in place 50 years ago, we would have been a lot quicker to
Well,
adopt things.
Yeah, things happen slowly.
I have two questions. Just ending with your last part, that the state gave the towns that control, that should have never been allowed. Because our founding fathers made it so that we're supposed to start at a town level, move up to the state, and then up to the federal. So for someone like me who has a belief to go back to old Constitution, old ways, founding fathers, the state should not have an overreach ever. The town should dictate to the state what we want done. So that's just my feeling on that. But my other question is, how come towns like Essex only have 4% or 2%? What's happening
Well,
there?
I think frankly, that's basically because for decades, the state has stepped back and let towns do their own thing in terms of zoning. And a lot of towns, particularly wealthier towns like Essex and very particularly down in Lower Fairfield County, have written their zoning regulations in a way that's very exclusionary. And that requires large lot zoning, that requires all sorts of high hurdles for entry, high barriers to entry, so that the, you know, in crass terms, the riffraff stay out. And that's been the effect of local zoning. And, you know, market dynamics change things also. And, you know, we've seen, like if you want to go even farther back than 50 years, a lot of the historic mill communities, Plainfield being one of them, or Putnam, or Thompson, or Norwich, or where you would have housing that was built before zoning, built up around the mill, often by the mill owners, that was affordable, or, you know, it's you get company credit or what have you. But over the years, things have changed dramatically, where, you know, work is, you know, half the people who live in Essex work in Hartford, or at Wesleyan in Middletown, or in New Haven. So it's not the same, you live near where you work, and so those dynamics have changed. People are sorted out across the state a little bit more. And a lot of the difference is in local regulation.
Thank you. And Mr. Cunningham, I just have one question for you. If we adopt this plan, is there any way that we can also address with planning and zoning, and while you're here, Mrs. Shinati, if we're going to look into this, I found it interesting in your presentation that it talks about like apartments over garages, in-law apartments. I would like to see that maybe reviewed, because in the town of Plainfield, from my understanding, we do not allow apartments over garages. There's zoning regulations on that.
We do allow apartments by special permit. They have to be accessible from inside the house. It can be over a garage as long as that garage is attached.
Okay.
It can't be a standalone building. A lot of people, myself included, thinks that special permit may be a little bit too overkill for an accessory apartment. So I am looking at rewriting the zoning regulations, and that is one thing that I will be working on. And it seems to me that a special permit, that's something that a commission has broader discretion over, because it may not fit in the area. An accessory apartment in, for example, that the Kranska House on Main Street in Central Village, that's a perfect location for an accessory apartment. And it makes sense to have an accessory apartment there. You know, and we limit our accessory apartments to 600 square feet. A lot of people think that's a closet, which, yeah, it's a closet. But that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at.
Okay.
They just can't be standalone buildings on the same lot. They have to be attached to the house and they have to be accessible from inside the house.
Now, is there any specific reason why we don't allow them in the standing alone garages versus even the attached? What's the issue there?
I was not
Fires.
here when the accessory apartment regulations were written. I can only presume that that would give the impression that there may very well be two principal uses on one lot, which an accessory apartment is smaller than the house. But at first blush, that could be a misunderstanding that people would make.
I think this plan gives Mary Ann and the Planning and Zoning Commission an opportunity to sort of ask those fundamental questions about why has it always been this way? Why aren't there detached structures? Why is it a special permit process? And the goal of zoning, in addition to sort of protecting the town's public health and safety, should say these things are important, these things are valuable, so we should make them easy. If these things, might be easier, if these things might be detrimental, or they should really only be in certain areas in certain circumstances, then they should be harder. But it's a way to sort of sort priorities.
I think my feeling is if we're looking at a ratio of where, you're saying homeowners are overburdened if they have the accessibility to put an apartment in, that's income. It also benefits our quote unquote low income. And I think that would benefit a lot of our existing residents before allowing maybe a lot of outside development to come in and make a lot of money.
Well, it could add to our affordability if it's the big A.
If you take a look at the last page where we're talking about that blue page, number 35, the second and third items are the ones that are important, and you hit it. We're talking about the ease of permitting requirements to promote the process, and that is where planning and zoning can help to rewrite that. So I think that's important, and this is the one right behind it. Talks about consider incentives for the income restrictions, because that gives them an opportunity to say, I want to do this because I could also benefit out of it. Now, correct me if I'm wrong with the names, was it Diversified Connecticut? Is that the group that was? Desegregated. That was the group that really wanted to have a one-size-fits-all across the board for the entire state when it comes to zoning. And that's why when you were talking earlier about there were a couple of towns further down the Fairfield County area that weren't allowing anybody. And that caused a big ripple, and that's why they wanted to try to get that one-size-fits-all, but which doesn't. You can't do that in a town of Plainfield or even small like Sterling or
Exactly.
it's just, I'm glad that they came up with the opt-out also. Because if you're doing things right, and I think we are, it gives you the option then to say, it's not by right. Accessory apartment is not by right. It's by going through the permitting process, and I think what we're doing is okay. So, comments, questions?
I have one more question, John. Is this being adopted throughout the whole country, in other states too? Are you?
There are states that actually have a much more stringent requirement. The state of New Jersey requires every municipality to adopt what they call a fair share plan, which that is the state basically dictates a number, and then every town has to come up with a 10-year plan to hit that number.
Is it help? They haven't done it in other states? Like there's.
Well, so I mean, New Jersey has taken a much more aggressive approach.
Yeah, New Jersey, but
California has taken a much more aggressive approach and
because
requires
they
the
have.
municipality to do
I
this.
mean, I know I don't equate this exactly, but the cities are just crowded with homeless people. So I don't know if they're making any bridges between that situation and affordable housing.
Well, this is where Connecticut's municipal structure is a little bit of a challenge, and I think it would benefit. Plainfield is a pretty diverse, diverse not only population-wise, but diverse urban areas, rural areas. But I think a lot of communities, Sterling, for instance, or if you look at Woodstock and Putnam, right next to each other, right, would definitely benefit from some group thinking, some coordination of that. But there's not a lot of opportunity in Connecticut just because of our structure to do that. But it's a good idea.
So Kentucky, Tennessee, different story?
In terms of what they would require? Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Or affordable housing plans?
Yeah.
Even? Probably not.
Probably not. Probably not. Yeah, and I mean, if you consider,
So
if you
she's
consider,
probably correct, the city.
yes, if you consider Connecticut sort of on the more progressive or liberal end of, you know, state regulation, and Connecticut is only getting around to doing this over the last 3 years, I would say, you know, a lot of other states are behind that curve.
Probably as your example, there are 139 towns that are below the 10%.
Right. A lot of communities have not felt a lot of legal or moral responsibility to do very much at all.
I think we've done well, but I think we can do better, and I think this does help that next step. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, we have the packet which you have in front of you, the Affordable Housing Plan, Town of Plainfield 21 through 26 plan.
And I'd like to make a motion to table this until we hear from planning and zoning, the ZBA on this. Because right now, I already have a problem with this one here. Modify zoning regulations to allow as of right thing to use.
Well, we already
just opted out, that why is it on the list? So I'd like planning and zoning board of appeals to go over this first and discuss it at the meeting so we can hear what they have to say.
If I could just clarify that opt-out, that wasn't specifically to opt out of affordable housing so that we can keep it at special permit. It's opt out of the act as a whole, which puts extremely onerous requirements on towns like Plainfield who are not in a position to be able to comply with those requirements for one reason or another. For example, we may not, may not be sewered, may not be water, and the 17-170 would have required, 2129 would have required the town to allow accessory apartments basically anywhere, attached, detached, at least one apartment. So it could have been more.
So
what the opt-out did is basically it reaffirmed Plainfield's intent to regulate their own development.
Yeah.
And so it could still, and I think in certain circumstances, what I'm hearing from Mary Ann is, if it's an attached unit, if it's within the primary structure, perhaps that should be as of right. It doesn't necessarily need to be every property under any circumstances, but I think moving towards that as of right in some cases is still a valid goal.
So then my follow-up question to that would be, if we were looking at the highlights on that page, with the white background for the lettering, those are the goals we discussed. There's still opportunities for modifications for those lines. So if we decide that we wanted to strike one or two of these or modify those, we can do that on the way.
But also find out before we adopt this, but
Well, you're going to get planning and zoning, ZBA. You could be getting, well, we don't even have any input from a housing officer because we don't have one.
right, I understand that.
The assessor input would also be their particular understanding of this.
Yeah, that would be valuable input too.
And keep
So we
it,
have
and if you,
all the time in the world to do it, right? So
no, we don't. We have to have it adopted by, and it has to be at the OPM by June 1st of next year.
So that
and
a month
this,
isn't going to
even-
hurt that.
No, it's
Right.
not.
With planning and zoning, ZBA, maybe the assessor could look this over and add their comments to it.
So you'd like to table it for a month, to come back to about at maybe the end of September select meeting? And give copies to all of the other boards and commissions for their review.
For planning and zoning board of appeals.
anyone want to be assessor?
I don't know how you want to work, because I don't mind going to their boards
Right.
to
I think there
hear
could be,
the review
to
on
table
it.
discussion at the end of their meetings.
Do you want me to have John at those meetings so that he can make the presentation and ask any questions? Answer any questions?
Yeah.
P and Z meets the second Tuesday. ZBA meets the first Tuesday.
Yes. Motion to table.
Taylor until, I don't
Mr.
know,
Clinton,
meeting
yes.
is.
Do we have a second?
I just want to get this final word on the date. Talking about, September 27th, I'm sorry, September 13th?
Will they have met by then, both?
Yes. Okay,
We
next-
meet on the-
when's your next meeting?
Next P and Z, I believe it's the 11th, or the second Tuesday, isn't that the 11th?
No, the second Tuesday in September is the 7th. I'm sorry, you are right, 14th. So we'd have to table it to the end of September, which would be the 27th.
I'll make a motion to table this until September 27th at our regular Board of Selectmen meeting.
Motion has been made, I'll second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We'll do that, and we'll also make sure we get some copies for all the boards and commissions ahead of time, so that they have questions. All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Oh,
I have, would it be possible for the Board of Selectmen to take one more measure before the next meeting and possibly put out a public survey to find out what the residents would like, what their voices would be, seeing how we don't have many in attendance tonight?
Well, it makes modifications to what we have here, because we already did a survey monkey, that was already done for the
There were only
presentation.
And we kept that extended and advertised that on the town's website and at meetings, because the response was so poor.
Yes, we take that into consideration, we'll talk to you about that at the meeting.
Thank you.
Motion to adjourn.
Yes, I'll do a motion.
All set. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye, 7:37.